Ladies and gentlemen, coming up just in a moment is Mr. Kent Brown. He is a 5-time qualifier for the Western Bass Classic. He's a 2-time qualifier for the the other way around. 5 times West Coast Bass Classic qualifier. 2-time Western Bass qualifier. Can't hit the tank worth a dang, and he's also the 2002 Western Bass Sportsman of the Year. He's going to be pitching and spinning and all kinds of goodies here today for you to make you a better bass fisher. How about a round of applause for one of the best in the West, Mr. Kent Brown, folks.
Thanks, Sep. You guys do catch Sep's radio show every Saturday morning, 6 to 8 a.m., 11:40 a.m. on the Sacramento's KHTK station where the Kings play. I know you guys are all Warrior fans down here, and once again, why? Yeah, I live in Sacramento. I'm sorry. As Sep said, my name is Kent Brown. I'm really happy to be here, and we're going to talk a little bit about fishing. I get to talk today about a little bit about jig fishing and plastic worm fishing. And the reason I kind of chose that subject is because I think it's probably one of the hardest techniques for a bass angler to learn. One of the toughest ways to start fishing for a bass. And we're going to cover several different techniques that you may use with that. And I know what you're thinking. Well, that ain't no jig he's got tied on. That's a spinnerbait. And you're right. And the reason I start my jig and worm seminar off with a spinnerbait, it's the only thing I can cast to hit the tank. No, it's really the reason I do that is I really want to show you the differences in, going down the bank fishing a spinnerbait covering water and slowing down and fishing a jig and fishing a plastic worm. One of the hardest things a bass fisherman has to do is slow down. We have a real hard time slowing down and fishing fairly slow, but that's what we're going to start to do. I would much rather go down the bank throwing a spinnerbait and covering water. If I cover a whole bunch of water, I think my chances of catching one is pretty good. But what happens is a lot of times I fish right over the top of those fish like I'm doing in this tank. And that's when I need to slow down. I need to pick the cover apart. I need to pick the bottom apart, and that's when I'm going to start throwing those different baits. To start off with, we're going to talk a little bit about jig fishing, guys. We're going to start talking a little bit about jig fishing. We're going to talk about those of you that fish the river and fish Clear Lake a little bit, fish any of the lakes with a lot of heavy cover, the technique of flipping and fishing the bigger jigs. And then we're really going to go into fishing some jigs on our reservoirs and how they are similar and how they are so much alike. One of my favorite baits to flip is a jig. And we're going to cover 3 or 4 different baits to flip with here, but one of my favorite baits to flip is a jig. And the one thing, how many of you have a flipping stick in your boat? Any of you? All right, the numbers are there. A few of you do a little bit of flipping. Flipping was really started here on the West Coast by a guy by the name of D. Thomas. D started the whole technique. It started with a 10-foot rod and evolved to a 7.5-foot rod. You'll notice a few things different behind my flipping stick as opposed to, say, just a standard casting rod that I would have. The rod blank, this guide, that first stripper guide is. The reason behind that is so I can get a good handful of line. I'm actually not casting the bait, I'm pitching the bait. Just flipping that bait out there and let it fall. And what I'm trying to do is swing that bait with a soft presentation into heavy cover. Tules, logs, trees, what have you. The jig I'm fishing, this is a 3/8 ounce jig. I do fish a lot of 3/8 and 1/2 ounce jigs when I'm flipping. 3/8 ounce jig. It's got a rattle chamber in it for a little bit of noise. It's got a big 5/0 hook, and it's also got a weed guard actually in that jig. Swing that jig out. I'm just going down the bank, picking that bait apart. Picking that bank apart with my bait, just working it along. I want it to imitate a crawdad. You notice when I'm swinging that bait out, I'm not swinging the rod like this. This is the first mistake a lot of you make when you try to start flipping. The whole idea behind flipping is I'm picking that line up, I'm pulling it down behind me, and I'm swinging it with the rod tip. It's all in your wrist. When that bait comes back to me, it's going to stop in front of me. When it comes back, it stops. I start my forward motion. That's where I'm going to set my bait back down. Once that bait hits the water and I flipped it into my target, I don't care if it's a boat piling, a tule point, up into a willow bush. Once that bait enters the water, I'm going to give that bait the rod. By giving that bait the rod, I do two things. I let the bait drop straight down on my entry point. If I don't give that bait the rod, it pendulums away from my target, and if I'm flipping up next to a piling or a bush or a tree or a tule point down on the delta, I pull that bait right out of that strike zone and right over the top of the fish. So I give the bait the rod, and it does two things for me. By giving it the rod here, if I get popped on the drop, as that bait's falling down, I get popped on the drop, you notice where my rod position goes? I'm ready to set the hook. If I get a bite now, I'm in position now to set the hook. I've got a good swing on that fish. Okay? What happens if I flip that bait out and I've got the rod up here, I don't have a long ways to go to set the hook on that fish. I want that rod down in front of me when I'm flipping. I want to be able to set the hook on that fish when I'm working that bait back. For flipping, I do use a Lamaglass 766, 7.5 foot flipping stick. A lot of times I fish mono. I do flip a lot of braid as well. I flip a little bit of braid on the California Delta, and I flip a little bit of braid up at Clear Lake. So I'm either fishing braid or I'm fishing 20 to 25 contest mono. I fish a lot of my Cincos and those types of baits on braid. We're going to talk a little bit about a new bait that's out. Some of you probably threw its little brother last year on the Delta, and I'm going to show you this new bait. If you guys are fishing the river in Clear Lake, they're pretty cool. What happens if I'm a little farther away from my target and I can't flip that far? Well, then I'm going to start pitching. And when I'm flipping, I've got my reel engaged in free spool. But when I start pitching now, I've got my reel in free spool, and I can swing that bait out and fish a little farther away from the boat. I tend to fish more pitching these days than I do flipping. I try to back off, stay a little farther away from the fish, and I don't care if I'm fishing a Cinco, a big jig, a brush hog, a big tube like Reaction Innovations tube or the beaver. I try to stay back away from those fish, and I do a lot of pitching with that bait. Trailers on your jigs. This is always interesting. How many of you still use pork rind? Any of you still use pork? How many of you use plastic pork chunks? I fish a lot of pork. I like it as a trailer, especially when the water's cold like it is this time of year. I'm fishing the California Delta, I'm fishing Clear Lake. I still flip a lot of pork rind on my jigs. It's soft, it's salty. The fish grab that jig, they'll hold on to it. For those of you that are fishing a pork trailer, a lot of times you have a hard time getting that pork trailer off your jig. That was one of the big deals that people got away from fishing pork. All you have to do is run that hook straight down, the down position, run the pork up to the barb of the hook and twist it. Just kind of unscrew it. I've got the Mylar wrapped up in there. Just kind of unscrew that pork and it'll fall off in your hand. Just twist it and come off. If you try to pull against the barb, that's what the barb's on there for. It'll stay. I mean, it'll definitely keep it on there. Some of my other favorite flip baits besides a jig, some of my very favorite flip baits are plastics. And I do scale down my plastics a little bit when I'm fishing. I flip a Cinco a lot. We'll talk a little bit about fishing Cinco. This bait here is a bait that's manufactured actually by the guy that won the FLW tournament. Ooh, I think he ate that crawdad out of self-defense. He thought he was going to get ate by that bait. Andre Moore, actually Andre's here sit up in the corner, but I sold your rod by the way too. We'll auction it off later, guys. Don't worry, hold on to your tickets. No, believe me, don't stick around. I'm not auctioning this rod off. Andre Moore owns a company called Reaction Innovations, and Andre won the FLW tournament at Beaver Lake in Arkansas on some of his baits, and we really kind of learned about fishing a lot of Andre's baits. His tube, Robert Lee won the Bassmasters over on the Delta last year on his tube, but this is a brand new bait that he's just introduced here at this show, and it's called a double wide beaver. A lot of you fished the smaller beaver that he had before, and that bait's really going to look like a crawdad. And now you're fishing that bait on a slip sinker or a screw-in weight, a fairly heavy weight. I fish it, from 3/8 up to an ounce of weight, but fishing from 3/8 up to an ounce. I like to fish a lot on a 3/8 ounce slip sinker in the Delta and Clear Lake, and a big 6/0 Gamakatsu EWG Superline hook. And that bait falls and that tail stands straight out. A lot of you, when we start talking about flipping, have gotten away from it and have gotten away from fishing a lot of other baits because the Cinco has been so successful for many of you. And as those fish start to get more and more accustomed to the Cinco, you're going to have to start looking for some other baits to flip. I flip a lot of tubes. I flip a lot of the beaver bait. I had 2 good finishes last year at the Delta. I only fished 2 events on the lake on the Delta last year. I was 5th in the Western Bass Classic, and I was 7th at the Everstart tournament that Gary Dobbins won over there. And a lot of my fish in both those tournaments I caught on this bait. So kind of a neat bait. This is a brand new, and it is available here at the show. And where'd he go? I don't want you to have any because you fish way too many of my spots. All right. You can't buy. Andre, do not let him buy any of these big beavers today, okay? Jig fishing in the reservoirs and jig fishing in the Delta are night and day, okay? I live up on a lake called Folsom, and we do a lot of jig fishing on Folsom. We start fishing the reservoirs. There's kind of a different factor in the reservoirs that we're looking for. The first thing is spotted bass. Not a lot of spotted bass in the Delta, a few up in the north end of the Delta. Because every time I say there's no spotted bass in the Delta, somebody always reminds me that there are in the northern end up by Wimpy's and all that good stuff. But for the most part, they're not a factor in the Delta. You're not going to win on the Delta or catch a lot of spotted bass in the Delta. But on the reservoirs, we do catch a great deal of spotted bass, and I catch a lot of them jig fishing from about October through the winter time through the spring. How many of you have ever caught a bass deeper than 40 feet of water? Deeper than 40. Deeper than 30. Deeper than 20. Yo, boy, that's us. Deeper than 10. Oh, I caught a deep one once. It was 15 foot, okay? It doesn't matter where I do seminars at, whether we're in Phoenix, whether we're in Pomona, whether we're in Sacramento. It's about the same number of people in the crowd. We start talking about deep water jig fishing. I get about 3, 4, maybe 5 people raise their hand. We start talking about fishing 40 to 60 foot of water. Bass fishermen vapor lock when we start talking about fishing that deep. Oh my God, 40 foot of water, I don't have that much line on my reel. Fishing deep is very easy. The problem is a lot of times is your equipment and the baits you're trying to fish deep. You notice we talked about flipping where I'm flipping a lot of 3/8 and half-ounce jigs, probably what a lot of you are, even a lot of 1/4-ounce jigs, especially a little bit later in the year. When I'm fishing a jig in the reservoir, I'm going to scale everything up and I'm going to scale some things down. First thing I'm going to scale up is the weight of my jig. I'm throwing 3/4 and 1-ounce jigs. This is a little skirted double tail. It's made by the Konami Bait Company. My good friend Derek Yamamoto has that company. A lot of you see the Konami stuff, and it is the same as the Yamamoto stuff. It just depends on where you're shopping. But this is a little skirted double tail jig that Konami Bait Company has out. The jig head that I'm throwing it on is a 3/4-ounce football head jig, and it's got a 4/0 Gamakatsu round bend hook in it. What a lot of you are doing is you're going out jig fishing on the lakes and you're tying on these jigs that you fish on the Delta flipping with a big 5/0 hook and a weed guard. You tie it on a casting rod, you make a blister long cast with it off the bow of your boat, and you can't feel anything. You're like, man, I can't feel anything when I'm fishing that jig back to me. Well, the reason you're not feeling a lot of that stuff is that jig's not on the bottom. You're not in constant contact with the bottom when you're working that bait back. This bait, a lot of times, the longest cast I ever make with a jig when I'm fishing deep is that right there. That's about all I ever do. Freeze pull that jig all the way to the bottom. From the top of this demo tank to the floor for you guys is about 9 feet. So about 4 times that, and I'm fishing in 40 foot of water. That's not too tough, really, guys, when you think about it. But the number of you that have caught a bass in 40 feet of water is very, very small. A lot of you get on the reservoirs and you see the fish on your meters down that deep, and unfortunately we've got that 1960 bass mentality that they only live on the bank and they only live next to a stump, and that's not true. Bass live on outside structure, and on our lakes, when those lakes are dropping in the fall, in the winter, those fish move out. They move out to the creek channels, they move out to the island tops, because that's where the bait's at. And when the bait's out there, that's where those fish are at. Once again, guys, the jig I'm trying to make look like a crawdad, okay? Because I'm trying to make that bait look like a crawdad, there's never a reason to fish it like this, okay? It's not a crank plug, it's a crawdad. I'm going to throw it out. Thunk hits the bottom, pick it up, set it back down. I throw it on a 764 Lamaglass, 7.5 foot flipping stick, 12 to 15 pound Berkeley big game mono line. You notice where I'm holding that rod is I've got my fingers up on the rod blank and I run the line between my thumb and forefinger. I can feel a lot more when I'm working that bait along with my line and with the rod blank. Now, I don't want you pointing at your fishing partners because I know everybody has a fishing partner that does this. But how many of you have been out there fishing a jig or a plastic worm along and all of a sudden your partner goes, it's like, dude, what are you doing? I got a bite. There's not a bass in this tank with hands, okay? Probably not one living in the lake that you fish with hands. When you lift that jig up and there's a little bit of weight on the end of that jig, set the hook. You got him. Okay, that's what you're looking for. Get in position and set the hook on that fish. With our good hooks out and our good quality, sharp hooks that we've got on the market, no reason to come, unglued on the bow of the boat, both feet off the front deck, setting the hook. A good solid pulling hook set will catch a lot of those fish, all those fish. You do not have to come unglued on the bow of the boat when you set the hook on that fish. Another thing you'll notice about my deep water jig, it does not have a weed guard in it. If you fish with this jig at 8 o'clock in the morning and then you return back to the dock at 3:30 after fishing all day long and you got the same jig tied on, you didn't fish it right. You got to slow that bait down, fish it right along the bottom. I'm going to throw that jig out. I'm going to let it sink all the way down to the bottom. Thump, hits the bottom. That's what we're doing with it. A lot of times when I'm fishing this technique, I'm actually dragging it with my electric trolling motor. I've got my Minn Kota turned down to 1 or 2, and I'm dragging that jig right along the bottom with my electric motor. I want it to look like a crawdad. We talk about fishing deep. How many of you wake up every Saturday or Sunday morning, sometime between Scooby-Doo and the NASCAR race, you guys watch those TV fishing shows? You guys watch those shows? Who's your favorite TV fisherman? Bill Dance, right? Hank's great. Hank's an awesome fisherman. All you guys who watch the Bill Dance show spend most of your day fishing, I know, with a fishing rod over your head like this while you're trying to reel them in, right? Because that's how Bill does it. Or you're fishing like rolling. Woo, son! Every time you catch one over 2.5. Those shows are filmed in Texas, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana. Those shows are not filmed on the West Coast. On our lakes that are deep, that are clear, that have spotted bass in them, that have a lot of fishing pressure. So don't get so wrapped up in the TV fishing shows that you watch thinking that you're going to be able to go out to Lake Oroville or Lake Folsom or Lake Comanche or Lake Don Pedro or Lake Shasta when you're up there on a houseboat trip and do a lot of those same things you see those guys do on television shows, because you're not. You're just flat not going to catch a lot of fish. Our Western techniques are very different from a lot of the things that you're going to see on television that you're watching. Those are ponds that don't see many fish a lot of times. And when you watch those shows, you really need to keep that in mind. I kind of saved this section a little ways into my seminar because if I start off with this, you guys think I have no clue how to fish a plastic worm. For some of you that have fished with me, you know I have no clue how to fish a plastic worm, but that's a totally different story. How many of you have done any drop shotting? Any of you done much drop shotting with a plastic worm? A pretty good crowd here then. We're going to be able to cost you a lot of money before the end of the day because that's our job, is to sell you new tackle. Otherwise, our job will be asking you if you need fries with that, okay? So keep that in mind. We want to make sure you buy a lot of tackle while you're here at the show. Now, the neat part about the drop shotting technique is it did turn a lot of fishermen that had a hard time catching fish on a worm into pretty good worm fishermen, okay? The reason behind it is what it does is it puts that worm up off the bottom, and how far up that worm is from your weight varies most of the time on what I'm seeing the bait fish do on my depth finder. If I'm seeing the bait fish way up off the bottom and I'm seeing a lot of movement, I'll fish that bait a little farther up my line. If I'm drop shotting and I'm not seeing a lot of movement and those fish are real near the bottom, then I'm going to move that hook down closer to my weight. The little baits that I'm drop shotting here, this is a bait that Robo makes. A little 4.5 inch straight tail worm, or this one is actually a little body shad. I want to start with a little 4.5 inch straight tail, and we're going to go through some of the other baits that some of you guys maybe haven't tried with drop shotting yet. This little 4.5 inch straight tail worm, a lot of you have probably fished this worm. Got a little number 4 Gamakatsu hook on there tied directly to my line, and I've got a little 3/16 tungsten weight. I don't fish the tungsten weight a lot when I'm practicing or I'm just fun fishing. I do fish tungsten when I'm fishing in a tournament. They're about $1 a piece, the weights are. If I'm fun fishing, if I'm just practicing, I fish a lead weight a lot. But in tournament competition, I do throw tungsten weight. Notice now I also go to a spinning rod, a little 7-foot medium light spinning rod, 6-pound test line. We've scaled everything down. We want to get a lot more bites. This is not the rig to go to the Delta with, okay? This is the rig to fish our foothill reservoirs with. It's the rig that when you're fishing for spotted bass. You go to Clear Lake, you go to the Delta with 6-pound line, this little bitty rod, you're in for some heartbreak. You are going to get broke off, okay? You'll get bites, but you're going to get broke off. The drop shot deal, that weight hits the bottom, and all I'm really doing with it is I'm just shaking it. Keep it in close contact with the bottom. Now guys, if you're fishing and you don't feel that, golf's not a bad game. You're going to have a lot more success at golf than you do bass fishing, okay? Because you're not going to catch many bass. You probably should stick to throwing top water. At least you'll know when you're getting a bite. All I'm doing with that little drop shot worm is I'm just shaking it along, shaking it along. That is just a gorilla. I can see him down there. It's more than my 6-pound line can handle. A lot of you fish the 4.5 inch worms with the drop shot technique. As the fish get more accustomed to it, there are a couple other baits that Robo makes that I really like fishing. The first one I'm going to show you is this little FX Sculpin. This little Sculpin bait, just a little straight tail bait. It is a very, very good drop shot bait, real small little bait. I fish on a number 4 hook. Scale everything down. What I'm trying to imitate when I'm fishing like this are the bait fish that are in the lakes. Most of the time in our reservoirs, our foothill reservoirs especially, when you're seeing bait fish on your depth finder, it's usually not shad minnows. It's usually pond smelt. They're a totally different type of bait fish. Now a lot of our lakes do still have a good population of shad minnows in them, but for the most part you're seeing pond smelt. If you're fishing Lake Oroville, Lake Shasta, Folsom, they're pond smelt. They're long, thin fish. You also hear a lot of people refer to them as a silver side, but they're really not a shad minnow, and that's what I'm trying to imitate with that bait. The other bait I fish that Robo makes is a little bait called a body shad. Same deal, it's got a little fat nose on it for nose hooking that worm, but a real thin tail. I don't get caught up in a lot of different colors. I throw about 4 different colors on the lakes when I'm fishing. I throw Aaron's Magic, I throw this color which is purple weenie, I throw a hologram shad bait, and I throw an oxblood bait. Those 4 colors will get you pretty basic, well-stocked tackle box on any lake that you're going to go to. You're going to be able to catch a lot of fish. The other way I fish a lot of plastic worms besides the drop shot technique is just a straight little 4.5 inch worm on a Texas rig with a little 1/8 or 1/4 ounce sliding sinker. 6-pound test line, a little 7-foot Lamaglass spinner rod, little sliding tungsten sinker, small Gamakatsu worm hook. This is a little 1/0 EWG, and a little 4-inch straight tail worm. And all I'm really doing with it is shaking it on the bottom. I'm going to throw that worm out. Once it's down on the bottom, I'm just going to shake it on the bottom, and I want to keep that bait in real close contact with the bottom. I'm not hopping it. I'm not doing a lot with it. I'm just kind of shaking that worm right along the bottom. It works very, very well. It's a good technique when the bite gets tough to scale that bait down and shake that little worm like that. A couple questions for you. How many of you have the same fishing line on your reels that you did last June? Any of you still have the same fishing line as last June? All right. There are more of you that have the same fishing line on your reel since last June than there are guys who have caught a bass deeper than 40 feet. You're proud. You're in a much larger group. If we were selling advertising to you, you guys would cost a lot more money because there's more of you, okay? All right. Let me tell you what you guys are going to do. I'm going to give you a scenario, and this is what's going to happen to you. Fish don't break fishing line. Fishermen do. I know you guys are laughing. How many of you have snap swivels in your tackle box? Oh, here we go. There's even more of you with snap swivels in your tackle box than there are anglers that have caught a bass deeper than 40 feet. Snap swivels make you lazy. I can change every bait in my tackle box in that compartment of my boat and never retie my knot and never lose that last foot, foot and a half, 2 foot of fishing line that takes all the abrasion. This is what's going to happen to you guys, or it probably already has. You're going to be out fishing Clear Lake, let's say, and you're fishing your jig, your crankbait, your spinnerbait, your new beaver, your tube, I don't care what you're throwing, and you do this. Oh man, hung up. Oh, the boat's drifting over. Oh, I got it loose. All right, I got it loose. I didn't lose it. Make another flip. Whew, didn't lose that jig. 20 minutes later, you've eaten a sandwich, you've moved 3 or 4 spots, you've drank a soda pop, boom, you get a bite. Set the hook on that fish, and it's a big one. You got her coming to the boat. This is, oh man, this is a good one. This, pow, fish breaks you off. Next year, you come to the ISE show, you walk down the aisle, you go buy the Strin booth, the Trilene booth, the P-line booth, the Maximum booth. I don't care what line you had on that fishing reel that day. You look at your partner and you go, I am never buying that stuff again, man. Yeah, remember when I lost that big one at Clear Lake? That's what I had on that reel. Oh man, I remember that fish. Then you guys keep walking down the aisle eating hot dogs. You broke that fish off. It was never the line's fault. You maxed the fishing line out. You stressed your knot, you stressed your line, you stressed everything. You didn't retie it. It was probably line you had on your reel since last June anyway, right? So now we're thinking probably need to buy some fishing line while we're here at the show. There's lots of it for sale. Pick a good quality line. I fish a lot, mainly all the Berkeley lines. I throw the Berkeley big game line a lot. I like it, and I do throw some of their spider wire stealth line. It's also a pretty good braided line. Fishing line, very important, guys. You know what? I can fish out of my $40,000 Triton, tow it with a $40,000 Ford pickup truck, got a $250 rod and reel in my hand. The only thing between me and a bass is about $6 worth of fishing line. So really, very, very important part of your fishing that you need to do that. My name's Kent Brown. Thank you for spending part of your day here at the ISE show, and enjoy your day here at the show. Buy some tackle so I don't have to get a real job, okay? Thanks, guys.